John Hunter was running one of his little groups at a historical society meeting here somewhere about 3 years ago. And he was talking about politics in New Mexico. And they were just about to quit, and I had to bring a check from the Historical Society to pay for the students' transportation, which I had in an envelope. And he was just finishing up about how to vote for women's rights. And I broke in on the thing and handed him the envelope, and I said, "Here's the funds you requested." I will make one minor apology to start with, and that is, in my previous life, I used view-graphs to talk from. And over the last many years, I have learned that historians routinely read from a document and don't use view-graphs. And so I said, well, at least I ought to try to mix them. So today I'm going to try an experiment in which I mix view-graphs and reading, and I apologize for whichever one you don't like compared to the other, but we'll start out. To clarify things, this is not related to the Taos revolt. This has to do with a mutiny that occurred in 1855 of the 1st Dragoons that occurred in the Plaza of Don Fernando de Taos in March. It occurred in the public eye of the main plaza. It is a very small event in history, there's no question about that. But the individual histories carry over into other events. However, before the story of the mutiny can be told, we need to set the time and the individuals that are involved. And the next few graphs. Well,
They did.
good. The Taos Rebellion occurred in 1847, and it was vigorously put down by the U.S. Army under Colonel Sterling Price and the Missouri Volunteers. The trial of the uprising leaders was held and several executed only a very short time after the violence. The makeup of the jury panel and the judges can hardly be called unbiased and would have made Southern juries of the 1940s who were trying a black man accused of raping a white woman as unbiased. The U.S. military was extremely biased towards the local population, and the feeling was mutual. Into this atmosphere entered a group of military officers and enlisted men who had not only the typical antebellum prejudices, but also long-standing interpersonal animosities. I want to describe the character of 4 men in particular: Brevet Major Philip Brooks Thompson, Major George Alexander Hamilton Blake, Bugler Private Aaron D. Stevens, and Taos resident Peter Joseph de Teves. Next slide. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Before we could get into the personalities, we need to place Cantonment Bergman. Now, we all know it as Fort Bergman, but that name was not applied until SMU took over the place. It actually was originally called a cantonment in the military time period. After the Taos uprising, U.S. troops were stationed in the Taos community from 1847 to 1852. One purpose was to defend the Taos Valley against the Hickory, Apache, and the Ute Indians. But it was also to prevent a repeat of the Taos revolt. The troops had easy access to Taos lightning, as we all know what that means, and women, much to the consternation of the 2 commanding officers, General Sumner and General Garland. Garland wanted the troops out of Taos area, but still didn't want them in the area of Taos. This was solved by establishment of Cantonment Bergman. Cantonment Bergman, in the next view graph. Here is Taos. Cantonment Bergman is approximately 8 miles from Taos and made the town a little less accessible for strong drink. Now, to tell people where it is if you don't know, this is Ranchos de Taos, and if you take the back road from Taos down towards Santa Fe, you come along this road, and cantonment to Bergman is located about in here. So it is some distance from the town of Taos. It made the town a little less accessible for strong drink. Notice, a little less accessible. In 1854, Major George Alexander Hamilton Blake was Commandant of Command at Cantonment Bergman. F Troop, 1st Dragoons, was under Brevet Major Philip Roots Thompson. He was stationed at Bergman to help control Indian depredations. Thompson was into, quote, strong drink. He was from Georgia and graduated from West Point, class of 1835. He was 36 in a class of a little over 50, so middle grade at the time. He received the brevet major rank as a result of gallantry at the Battle of Sacramento near Chihuahua in 1847. He was reported to have been a pretty fair soldier for a drunkard, and had somehow managed to stay drunk from Fort Leavenworth to Bent's Fort. That's a quote. While traveling from Fort Leavenworth in June of 1851, he found an Indian sulking around his tent. He grabbed his horsewhip and gave the Indian 4 or 5 lashes. This did not sit well with the nearby Indians, and Colonel Sumner had a hard time, but he did succeed in preventing a fight. Later, Thompson was being sent to Galisteo and planned to visit his wife, who was housed at Barclay's Fort. Think about this, wife coming out. Barclay's Fort, for those that might not know, is a little bit down the road from Fort Union, and I understand now we can get to it. But instead of getting to Barclay's Fort, he got ingloriously drunk. And on his way, he, without a word, discharged a pistol at a man bending over a fire, inflicting a wound. The man was a discharged soldier, and the event was witnessed. The arresting officer was Major George Blake. The man did not die, and Thompson was turned over to the civilian authorities for criminal law. He was fined $600, which turns out to be about $17,000 today, a rather significant fine. And he was ordered to join the temperance union in Santa Fe. That didn't work. He was expelled. On an expedition against the Navajos, Thompson found himself overwhelmed, and Blake's command rescued his troops. So you can see the tensions building up between the two majors. And yet Thompson was apparently pretty well respected as a commander when he was sober. While in Taos, some distance from Cantonment Bergman, St. Vrain has a distillery. Back up right about in here somewhere. Most people don't know that. They hear about Turley's Mill, but they don't hear about St. Vrain's. There's not apparently much left of it, but apparently people do know where it is. But it was a little bit below Cantonment Bergman. At that time, drunkenness in the Army was not only common, but generally considered acceptable. Oliva, in his work on Fort Union, quotes a soldier as stating that, quote, "It is too much the impression among us that whiskey justifies anything, and that the free use of it is a necessary qualification of a gentleman." Next few graph. During the court, next week, next few graph. There. During a court-martial, Assistant Surgeon Barry was asked to define drunk. He stated, "I consider a man drunk only when he is totally unable to know what he is doing and to stand up without support." All right, I don't see us doing that on driving these days. Whiskey was part of Army rations until 1865. Okay, next, please. Our next character is Major George Alexander Hamilton Blake. He did not attend West Point and succeeded in being appointed directly as a first lieutenant in the 2nd Dragoons in 1836. And he became a major in 1847 for meritorious action in Mexico. He came from a politically influential family, as you might guess, in Philadelphia. His father had immigrated from England and became an important publisher of music in Philadelphia. Blake fought in the Second Seminole Campaign in Florida and was commissioned brevet major for action in Cerro Gordo in Mexico, and in the Mexican War. His first assignment in the New Mexico Territory was in Galisteo in 1851. Later, he was directed to locate and establish Fort Massachusetts, which we'll talk about, in 1852. Next view graph. This is Fort Massachusetts. Now, you can barely see it, but many of you know where Little Bear Blanca is outside of the La Vida Pass, going over the mountains to Colorado, or in Colorado. Not necessarily, and then on this side of it is also the San Luis Valley, which is noted for warm springs and lots of moisture. And now we build a fort there at the base of Little Bear Blanca. You can imagine what it was like in the winter, and then in the summer, the mosquitoes must have been fierce. The post was actually abandoned in 1858, and Fort Garland, the one we know of now, was established. Next view graph. Blake was Commandant of Cantonment Bergman. He was an officer, quote, well disliked. He was a strict disciplinarian and a martinet. He reportedly allowed a drunken riot to occur at Fort Massachusetts by hiding in his room. He threatened one soldier to desert so that he could be captured, and that he, Blake, could administer 50 lashes on the soldier's back. Next view graph. This turns out to be the interesting character in the whole story. The third person was Private Aaron D. Stevens. At the time of the riot, Stevens was bugler in F Troop 1st Dragoons under Thompson. He was a Puritan stock, noted for superior bravery, but he had an explosive temper. He served in the Massachusetts Volunteers in the War of Mexico, but ended up to be under a very disreputable commanding officer and never made it into combat. He later enlisted in the Dragoons. Next slide. This is another very interesting fellow. He played an important but unrecognized part in the civilian, as a civilian named Peter Joseph de Taos. He immigrated from the Azores in about 1828, as best we can tell, and appears in Taos somewhere between about 1838 and 1840. He purchased Turley's Mill property in 1847 and opened a large number of stores, property. He was really an investor. And he owned a significant fraction of the Taos Plaza by 1862. When he died in 1862, his estate was valued at $68,000. His estate is down at the State Archives. His son, some people may know a little of New Mexico history. His son, Antonio, was one of the early delegates to the U.S. Congress from the territory of New Mexico. Okay, let's go to the next few graphs. This is the Taos Plaza, and I'm saying about 1880. And let me tell you that I've created that date out of the whole cloth. That's about the best we can do on it. As far as we know, it's about the earliest real drawing of what Taos Plaza looked like. The important part we want to think about is right in here. This is a portal. There's a building here. This one still exists. To give you an idea of scale, that's a donkey right there, a burro. On March 8th, 1855, Brevet Major Thompson and his company F, plus loaded wagons and cannons, left Cantonment Bergman to Fort Massachusetts to join Colonel Fauntleroy's campaign against the Utes. Thompson had the men stop at St. Veraine's Mill, that's just down the way, where Thompson bought, and I quote, half a gallon of whiskey to be divided among the troops. Now, this is 40 men or so. He also bought a second measure, whatever the measure was. The troops then proceeded to Taos, and let's have the next slide. At the time, Blake also went into Taos, where he joined Lieutenant Johnson, who was second in command of F Troop. And they were here, and both went into Taos ahead of the troops to conduct, quote, public business. Okay, let's next one. Now, I hope these come through a little bit. This is just to give you an idea of what dragoons would look like in that time period, 1855. This is a corporal. Notice the rifle, the equipment. So this is an officer. And the next one, next graph. This is what they probably look a little bit more like. This is what they would look like on a field campaign, including this fellow here, who really doesn't look like a military uniform. Thompson, next view graph. Okay, now here we get into a little Corky Hawk, John Ramsay communication. We have been unable to find a drawing of the Taos Plaza from the 1850s. And this is made up, it's our best guess of what the Taos Plaza might have looked like. This is the old church. This is the wall we're looking at. Number 3 here is the important number. It actually was Peter Joseph's store and bar. A portal existed in this. The troops would have marched in from Bergwin up this path, come into the plaza, and then planning to go out that path, or road really, to go up to Fort Massachusetts. So that's about what it looks like. Thompson allowed the company to stop in the plaza to purchase light articles that could not be obtained at Bergwin. Tobacco, pipes, matches, gloves, and other similar items. This meant that there were some 40 to 45 mounted men, some already, quote, tight, were gathered in the confines of the plaza, probably no bigger than the current plaza. There was considerably inviting at Peter Joseph's store, and probably 1 or 2 other bars that existed. Major Thompson was actually observed drinking with a private. Now, those of you that may have had military experience know that enlisted men and privates do not sit at bars and drink together, even today. During that time, Major Blake was in the store, but there's no clear testimony that he observed Thompson and the private drinking together. However, there apparently was a heated exchange between Thompson and Blake. An incident involving a private Sullivan triggered an event. Sullivan was so drunk that he could not sit or stand on or sit on his horse. Major Thompson ordered Sergeant Fitzsimmons to tie Sullivan to his horse. Now, how you tie a drunk to a horse, I'm not quite, particularly when he can't stand up, I'm not quite sure, but I don't. Anyway, Sullivan struck at Fitzsimmons, who struck back. Blake saw Fitzsimmons strike Sullivan and ordered Thompson to arrest Fitzsimmons. A little confusion. Thompson refused, and Blake put Fitzsimmons under arrest. Blake then went into Peter Joseph's store and was observed writing. Mounted on his horse, a private Cooper charged over to Peter Joseph's store and tried to ride his horse under the portal. Both he and the horse fell on the stoop. Wonder about it? Blake came out of Joseph's bar and told Thompson to take the troop out of town. Thompson delayed, and Blake threatened to take the company out of town himself. This offended Major Thompson, needless to say. Private Cooper said to Blake, "You've been nigger-driven long enough. We've been nigger-driven long enough. It's time now you to give us a little rest." He'd been one of the troops at Fort Massachusetts, which was pretty well driven in building Fort Massachusetts. A scuffle ensued, and Blake drew his sword and struck Cooper with it. Now, one might imagine that why didn't he cut something off? Apparently, the military was pretty well trained to use their sword in the broad sense, not cutting somebody, but just using it as a weapon, as an attack, strike sideways. Blake struck Cooper 2 or 3 times with his fist. Cooper caught Blake by the collar, and Blake said, You're the damn son of a bitch I've been looking for so long, and I'm glad to have got you at last. A scuffle ensued, and Blake drew his sword and struck Cooper with it. As many as 3 or 4 of the other soldiers joined the fray and had their hands on Blake at one time. One man had a knife in his hand, but was not seen making any attempt to use it. Someone shouted, "Kill the damn son of a bitch. Let me kill the son of a bitch and let them hang me for it." These were really well liked. As Blake was freeing himself from Cooper, Private Fox was on horseback and with a saber and struck at Fitzsimmons. At one point, Private Fox was observed riding among the troops shouting, "Kill the goddamn long-nosed son of a bitch," including the Brett Blake. This part of the melee was broken up, and Privates Cooper and Fox were arrested and taken to the local jail. Private Steele struck Fitzsimmons on the hand with a saber and attacked Blake by grabbing his neck handkerchief and hitting Blake 2 or 3 times with his fist. Blake defended himself using his saber. Now all of this is taking part. You got a picture right downtown Taos. The soldier then attacked, Ramon Baca, Major Blake's servant, made a significant attempt to break up the fight between Blake and the soldiers. 3 or 4 soldiers came up, one on horseback, and commenced to strike Blake. The soldiers then attacked Baca and chased him, cutting at him with sabers and the butt of a gun. One pursuer was on horseback. Kid Carson, by this time, had shown up. And he shouted at the other, quote, Mexicans, accused them of being cowards for standing around and seeing a man killed. Carson convinced them to gather rocks and defend Baca, which they did, and Baca escaped. After the attack on Major Blake stopped, Blake announced to the remaining troops, now he'd just been beat up, "I can whip any man in the company with any arm which he wished to take, from the right to the left of it." Bugler Private Stevens then responded, "I accept your challenge and will fight you any damn way you want to fight, with gun, pistol, or saber." Blake turned and walked away towards Peter Joseph's store. Stevens replied, "By God, Major Blake, you shouldn't say that," or words to that effect. U.S. District Judge P.E. Brockus, a rather interesting character in his own right, he was the district judge there, recognized that Stevens had not participated in the riot and suggested to Major Blake to speak to Stevens. In doing so, Blake offended Private Stevens, and Stevens pointed his rifle at Blake's chest and exclaimed, "Damn you, I'll blow your heart out," or words to that effect. Having previously said, "Damn you, I'm as good a man as you are," Kit Carson, Judge Brockus, and Major Thompson seized the gun and arrested Stevens. A number of troops, while not actually participating in the attack on Major Blake, were riding through the troops trying to incite them to participate. During the previous events, the group of soldiers attacked a group of Mexicans, hitting them with rifle butts. Lieutenant Johnson was able to quiet that incident. Blake also accused Fitzsimmons of overreacting to an attack by a drunken soldier. After the riot had subsided, Sergeant Fitzsimmons was released from the arrest by Blake and assisted Thompson in taking the troops out of Taos and on to Fort Massachusetts. Blake came out of the riot injured and required medical care for several weeks, to the point that he delayed reporting the incident to General Garland. So now we've got court-martials. Court-martials at the time were notoriously biased. Testimony of an officer was always accepted as far more reliable than that of an enlisted man, independent of the situation. The judge advocate was responsible not only for prosecution, but also for the preparation of the defense. Next graph. Privates Cooper, Steele, and Fox faced court-martials for mutiny, and Private Stevens was charged with threatening for an officer. he didn't mutiny, but that he threatened. And these were all capital crimes and subject to the death penalty. All were found guilty and sentenced to be shot. But the sentences needed to be approved by Franklin Pierce. Major Thompson was called as a prosecution witness for the court-martial at the privates. Thompson was intoxicated when he appeared at the third trial. He was harsh and abrupt with the judge advocate. He interrupted the court several times. At one point he made a statement, quote, "a peculiar, emphatic, and at the same time with a significant gesture with his finger." Quote, "The 4 enlisted men were tried and all found guilty. The results of these court-martials were submitted to the Adjutant General, who submitted them for approval to President Pierce. The response was formulated and written by Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who was at that time. And it's rather interesting that both Jefferson Davis and Thompson were in the same battle in Mexico. Now, whether they knew each other or not, we don't know. But at least Jefferson Davis probably knew a little bit about Thompson. The response, the response was formulated and written by Jefferson Davis, who was a West Point graduate and had served in Mexico with the Dragoons. Next photograph. Actually, the note is from Franklin Pierce, who was also a member of the military at one point and in Mexico. He says, among other things, that his duty to order the execution, it was his duty to order the execution of the sentence of death if he were not compelled to find something to mitigate the crime of these men in the general condition of their company and in the misconduct of the officers. Both officers and men could be taken as equally guilty. It appears that no proper discipline could be maintained in the company. And Pierce mitigated the sentence of death to 3 years at hard labor, under guard, and without pay at Fort Leavenworth. The President also stated, next graph, the non-commissioned officers and men of Company F, 1st Dragoons, will no longer be trusted to serve together as a company. They will be distributed as privates to other companies serving in New Mexico. The commander of the Department of New Mexico would prefer proper charges, next graph, would prefer proper charges against the officers and non-commissioned officers who did not do their utmost to suppress the riot, and also against the major. While the 4 were transferred to Fort Leavenworth in irons, where they were supposed to have walked, they did have one opportunity, and that is they were sent with the group that took Governor Calhoun back when he was sick, and they got to ride in a wagon back to Fort Leavenworth. Thompson was charged and tried at a general court-martial. Next graph. He was tried, obviously, for his significant gesture. Thompson stated, now it's interesting that the makeup of the court-martial included Major Blake as one of the officers, plus the man that had served as judge advocate. I mean, if you talk about creating unbiased boards. Thompson stated that Blake had strong prejudices and that his opinions would be too much biased. He did have the opportunity to object. Interesting, Blake argued that the objections had no foundation. But the court agreed with Thompson, and they released Blake, and Bowen, who was the judge advocate, resigned from the board. In his defense, Thompson stated that he was required to wait about half an hour on a most unpleasant, windy, and dusty day, and where not even a seat had been provided for a witness. Also, that Captain Bowen, the judge advocate, had addressed him in so rude and harsh a manner as to excite strong feelings. The court found him guilty and cashiered. Now, the word cashiered, they threw him out of the service. rather interestingly, two members of the court, Captain Magruder and Brevet Major Gordon, attached an appeal to the sentence asking the president to mitigate the sentence against Major Thompson. But President Pierce upheld the penalty. Next few graphs. Major Blake is then arrested and charged with just about everything they could think of, including charges that he had been charged with several years previously, and the charges were dismissed. The charges included swearing and cursing at non-commissioned officers and soldiers, hiding from the riot in Fort Massachusetts, producing a spirit of discontent, leaving Major Thompson in command of Cantonment Bergman when Thompson was drunk, not arresting Major Thompson for Thompson's actions at Taos, and not helping to calm the riot. After several days of trial, including testimony related to the details of the riot and a postponement to await the arrival of federal Judge Raucus, who was going to appear as a defense witness, Blake was found guilty of dereliction of duty and failing to arrest Major Thompson for disobedience, and as a senior officer president, did not do his utmost to suppress the riot. Next few graphs. His sentence was 1 year and loss of pay, but General Garland reduced it to 1 month. Okay, now we go on to the next few graphs. Every one of these become a very interesting character after the story. How many people know the old definition of the word filibuster? Those of you who are professors of history should know what a filibuster campaign is. There's one. How many people think that filibuster applies to modern Congress? In the late 1800s, a filibuster campaign was created by somebody who would create a private army, invade one of the territories south of the border with the idea of taking it over, either to make it part of the United States, create an independent country, create a slave state, or whatever. William Walker was nearly successful. He controlled much of Nicaragua at the time, and this was called a filibuster campaign. Thompson joined William Walker's campaign right after he was cashier, and Walker was in charge of one of the bases that William Walker had along the river, and the area was attacked, and needless to say, probably Thompson was drunk, and things didn't go very well, and Walker lost and was actually arrested and so on and so forth. Thompson and his wife, who went along with him, were taken aboard a U.S. ship to be taken back to the United States. Thompson died at sea while returning to the U.S. Interestingly, there are comments about the wife remarrying another soldier after she returned. So she would make an interesting history for somebody. Okay, next few graphs. Okay, now we have the 4 privates. These were now supposedly sitting at Fort Leavenworth. Private Fox was released early and rejoined the Dragoons, and they actually find him serving in Gettysburg. So he became active in the military. Privates Cooper, Steele, and Stevens escaped. 3 out of 4. And I say I know no further records of Cooper and Steele, and I comment on that a little later. The next one. Now we get to the interesting fellow, the one guy who has a little bit of gleam on his history here. Cooper escapes, and the first thing he does is he joins the Free Kansas movement and becomes Captain Whipple, to hide his name, and fights on the Free Kansas side for some time. He eventually joins John Brown. where he becomes a captain or a colonel in John Brown's army, and is in fact at Harper's Ferry, where he is shot, seriously injured, captured, held in prison for some time, and eventually hung as one of the rioters from Harper's Ferry. Next. Blake is transferred out of New Mexico and is transferred to Fort Cajon, California, and it's said there that the troops there hoped he would drown. At one point, he took leave and spent several months in Europe, and his file has a number of letters that next week I will be in Rome, and he apparently made quite a trip. The next thing you find is in 1860, he took a group of recruits to Oregon. Next you graph. He participated in the Peninsula Campaign and at Gettysburg. He became a brevet brigadier general and was actually nominated to become a major general in 1866. In 1870, he was in charge of Carlisle Barracks, and the comment is that General Sherman encouraged him to retire. And he died in 1888. Next one. Now, we talk about politics today. This letter is in, and I have to read this one. This is in Blake's file. From Congressman O'Neill from Philadelphia, dated January 6, 1866, addressed to Secretary of War Stanton. The Colonel is a Philadelphian, where many members of his family have served for years. They have been known to me from my boyhood and have a large circle of friends among my constituents. I would be very much gratified indeed if I could be considered as having, even in the remotest degree, aided in having this compliment bestowed. Now, where did that talk about politics? Next letter. This mutiny is a small event, but it illustrates, number one, the tensions that occurred in New Mexico between the military and its residents. It's a little different from some that you hear. But it also shows that the military was not the days of the Rin Tin Tin movies or whichever that was, of being all friendly. There was a lot of serious competition and dislike among the officers. Yet, these tensions, despite it, that there was brought a significant level of security to the region. And next. The material for this talk, the basis of it, is in a book, Taos, A Topical History, and edited by Karina Sanestevan and Julia Moore. It's published by the Museum of New Mexico. It came out in November. But rather not interestingly, in the New Mexico Historical Review of the summer of 2013 is an article on the same topic by William Gorenfeld, who is a lawyer, a dedicated military historian in California, particularly Fort Cajon, and provided me with a lot of information. Tim Kimball from Albuquerque also is quite knowledgeable in the names of people involved in the military, and they all help a lot in providing the details of this and make it a little more interesting. Next feature. I can even show this. I do recommend those of you that may be interested in basically the history of Taos, this book. Karina Sanestevan, some of you who are aware, she was the mother superior over years in trying to get a book on the history of Taos written. Julia Moore is a phenomenal editor who took 300,000 words of documents and reduced it to about 130,000 so that the museum would publish it. And it came out in November of this year. I think there's one more. Nope, that's it. Okay. Any questions? certainly an assignment of troops there for a while. And must admit, I just have not done my homework, but there must have been some sort of housing there. There were a number of people whose names appear as having been at Galisteo. And the fact that a major was there indicates there was a fair number of troops there. Next? Yes.
Did the Taos buy Truly Mill after the Taos revolt?
Did the what?
Did the Taos buy the Truly Mill property after the Taos
Yes,
revolt?
it was bought from the estate.
What did he do with it?
I don't know.
One more question. Taos Lightning was produced at Truly Mill, but also at St. Vrain's?
I think Taos Lightning is sort of the general name for any locally produced whiskey or alcohol. I think you don't want to even give it the name whiskey. It must have been pretty raw. But probably the Turley's Mill is in ruins.
Right.
And so I suspect he did not, and it of course was destroyed in the revolt. So I suspect that Joseph probably bought the property, which seemed to be what he liked to do. He really owned a fair amount of property when he died. And obviously he made a lot of money at it too. He didn't bring money into Taos. He made it there at $62,000 in 10, 15 years is real profit making. Oh, yes.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between Fort Garland and Fort Massachusetts.
The only thing I really know is that Garland was created so that they could abandon Fort Massachusetts. And because it became obvious that it was not a good place to, and it had been put, there were reasons to put it there. It's closer to La Vita Pass, which was the popular one. And it had access to wood, it had access to water. It just was a miserable place to live, and at least Fort Garland was out in the open.
Didn't John C. Fremont take refuge at Fort Massachusetts when he got lost up there on one of his surveys?
I don't,
I think so.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Makes sense.
Wherever. Yes.
What did the Ortegas think of these crazy military guys fighting each other? Was there any
Well,
record of that?
no, not in the area that I've looked at. I must admit that my depth of history is pretty superficial. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.